Good morning, everybody. It's really wonderful to be here. My name is Justin Adams. I'm currently a partner at Just Climate, part of Generation Investment Management. But I want to just start out with a little bit of the journey that I've been on, because I've been focused on the climate challenge for over 25 years now, and the first 10 of those was very much focused on the energy transition. But about 15 years ago, when I was working at BP, I built BP Ventures. We started to invest into forests and agriculture systems as a means of looking at kind of where and how could we do more with the biological sink of carbon as a means of sort of balancing the continued use of fossil energy. That journey has then taken me over the last 15 years to build a fund at the World Bank to try and invest into forest landscapes. I spent 5 years at the Nature Conservancy, where we really started looking at this intersection between nature and climate as to how much could be done, working with nature and transforming how we managed, conserved and restored landscapes to address the climate challenge. I moved to the World Economic Forum and led a coalition of the biggest private sector companies working to transform their supply chains to address their nature and climate impacts. And then finally, I've ended up and spent the last 12, 18 months working with Generation to really understand, so how can we invest into this sector? Is this sector at a tipping point that means that we can really accelerate solutions and work with nature, work with natural climate solutions to address this challenge? So the fact that this meeting is taking place at all is a sort of testament to sort of one of the ways that the conversation has evolved, because I think so many people now in the investment world, asset owners, asset managers, are asking the question of how we can invest in nature. And so the awareness of the challenge that we have around nature decline has grown. But unfortunately, the solutions and certainly the amount of money moving into the space is still far from where it needs to be. But just to reinforce how important this issue is, I had a wonderful pleasure last weekend to go out and spend an evening listening to the wonderful mythical bird that is the nightingale. And I don't know if any of you have heard the nightingale. It's sort of endemic across much of Europe and Asia, but it is a bird in chronic decline. So 90% of the nightingales have disappeared from the landscape of the UK in the 50 years of my life. So that we are now estimated to have between 5,000 and 6,000 breeding pairs of nightingales. And it's just one indicator of the broader concern that scientists are warning of a sixth mass extinction. We've lost 70% of species abundance in the last 50 years. So it's a real challenge, and the biggest sector that stands to lose from that is the land-based sectors, because we rely so much on intact nature for so many of the services that make farming and forestry the profitable industries that they are today. And so we've been incredibly good at providing relatively low-cost food to now a population of about 8 billion people, but it has come at a huge expense to nature and a huge expense to the climate. About 22% of all emissions from all sectors come from what's called AFLU, the agriculture, forest, and land use sectors. So it's a huge part of the climate challenge, as well as the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. So it's absolutely imperative that we find a way of shifting the momentum and turning the tide of where we are today. So the great news is that we actually know a lot of what needs to happen. We have technology that enables us to start mapping what we can do and understand what is happening in landscapes. So spatial planning and the ability to optimize our landscapes is better than we've ever had, and technology will continue to evolve that. the engagement of corporates to try and understand how they can address emissions in their own supply chains and provide financing to start to address that has now greater than ever, the sort of awareness that's there from the corporate sector. And I think the awareness that's there now from many in the investment sector. But one of the biggest challenges for me in the last 12, 18 months has been just to understand how high the bar is if we're going to unlock the trillions of dollars that we need, or the billions of dollars that we need initially to start to invest into nature, to start to invest into more regenerative and more diverse agricultural and forestry systems that it will enable us to actually bring solutions forward. So that's the great challenge that we've got. And I think as I look at the people in this room and the people who've been invited to this conference, I think the challenge for all of us is to really think creatively and to think boldly, how can we come up with solutions that will address what asset owners are needing? And particularly as we move into we're in a deeply inflationary environment, and so where and how can we encourage more investment to be coming in at a time when there are so many challenges to the sort of global economy? And one of those areas, and I think the key if we're going to unlock private sector finance, is to really get markets for ecosystem services to work. And so we hear so much about the carbon market, both positive and negative. But the reality is, if we're going to bring private sector finance to work, and the gap in financing for biodiversity runs into hundreds of billions of dollars. 86% of the finance that's currently provided for biodiversity today is from public sector. And all of the governments are turning around and producing plans, which is the private sector is magically going to appear with all of this money to invest, because we all understand how important the problem is now, and we're going to invest into these solutions. But as we look at what is investable today, it's really difficult to see that. So ecosystem services, carbon markets, ultimately biodiversity markets, and maybe water markets are one of the few ways that we can see that we're actually going to be able to unlock any investment at scale. And so right now, the voluntary commitments that are there that are underpinning the carbon market is the best we've got. We've got to figure out how we bring the integrity and understanding of these markets to a point where we can encourage more investment to come in, because without that, we will lose the one bright spot of where new private money is flowing into this space. And so that's something I know we're going to address in multiple of the panels today. But as we then look, another area is the real assets area, and I know many of you, we're going to have a panel directly after this talking about real assets. That, to our mind, is one of the only ways that we can put products together where you've got sufficient we're going to be able to underwrite the risks because of the underlying asset that sits there. Without those real assets, it's also incredibly difficult to see how we can start to scale the financing. And that is a challenge because, as you all know, then real asset investing works in some markets, but in many of the areas where we desperately need investment, particularly in the global south, that's also not a possibility. So there we've got to be looking, how do we start to do more with concessionary finance that's going to enable us to underwrite some of the risks in those markets. But fundamentally, this is about bringing the innovation, this is about bringing entrepreneurs, this is about supporting farmers, and this is about working together. And the one thing I would really encourage is that we start thinking about unusual partnerships of how we can actually address some of these challenges, because the solutions will exist in the intersection of what we're looking at calling the restoration industry, but it's the intersection between the agriculture and the food sector, the forestry sector, and the conservation community. In the conservation world, there's all sorts of wonderful ideas, but they're never going to get to the scale. But there's all sorts of opportunities to learn from the work that's happening there to inform new opportunities and new solutions in the agriculture space, new solutions in the forestry space. So that's what I'm hoping we'll have a chance to get into over the next couple of days. The problem could not be more urgent. And yet the solutions are still, they're still far from certain. So I think that's now where we've got to really work at what is happening and where there is the momentum. And right now, that's around getting the ecosystem service payments working. And the last comment I would make, I don't think there's anybody from government here, but unless and until we get more regulated markets for these ecosystem services, we're still going to be reliant on the voluntary action, which is never going to get us to the scale that we ultimately need. So I think there's also an imperative for all of us to be thinking, how do we encourage smarter, aligned policy that will enable this investment to take off? So I look forward to the discussions, and I think, Hayley, we're going to welcome up the panel to move us into the next section. So thank you all.